I want to go through some different points in order to see where we come at this point. So the first is we need to talk about what we mean by classical liberal. What therefore would a classical liberal system of government ideally look like? And then we'll compare the UK Parliament and the structures of lawmaking in the EU. Obviously, the UK Parliament is simply one relatively classically liberal form of lawmaking. By far, by no means the only one, but it's the one I'm most familiar with, so we'll talk about that. We'll also look at why, in my view, the features of the EU system are quite illiberal, and why it's trending towards, whatever we may like to think about it, whatever we may hope for, it's trending towards less liberal and less democratic lawmaking. Why do I want to do this? I have to apologize in advance that we are going to have to go down into some detail, and actually rather labyrinthine kind of potentially a bit dull detail. But the problem with this is that in order to understand what the EU does, you have to get into this detail, because otherwise you will not know how law is made in your name. And it's something that in our interesting referendum battle almost never came up. And certainly the pro-Remain sort of side in this debate really did not discuss very much what the EU actually does. So I think that's very important. Why do I want to talk about Bismarck and the making of sausages? That will become clear. It's important to understand the historical precedents for this system. Clements talks about the Holy Roman Empire, indeed. What it may mean for the future, the problems with the concept of harmonization for liberals, the concept itself, going back to a philosophical grounding on why I believe that we're going full circle from liberally informed freedoms to submission to illiberal states or a superstate in the EU, and some further readings if you're not utterly exhausted after 2 hours of this. So what do we mean by classical liberal anyway? Here's a suggestion. Liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on liberty, the consent of the governed, and equality before the law. The British liberal tradition has emphasized expanding democracy. I'm suggesting this as a definition. Are you okay with this? Do you have any thoughts at this stage? In that case, we would expect a classical liberal government to be typified by, to demonstrate, more directly elected versus unelected lawmakers, a transparent versus opaque decision-making system, ability instead of the inability to remove those lawmakers, in other words, democratic control over the appointment, revocable versus unrevocable law, so that, or lawmaking, I should say, so that it's what we call the lever of voting works. When you vote for something, the party is able, that you vote for, or individuals you vote for, are able to do it and change it back. And that lawmaking should be relatively comprehensible, not labyrinthine, not so complex that it's impossible for the average person to understand. And so with those characteristics, if we are under a classical liberal system of lawmaking, the tendency to those we would expect would be expanding, not reducing. So what I'll do now is go on and compare the UK and the EU. And this argument comes from, it's an article I was lucky enough to publish in newspapers, the Daily Telegraph, a little while ago. And I said, let's picture the referendum that we've just had as if we were starting a state afresh. Let's think, what if we think about it like that? What would classical liberals decide? What if we were starting this new country kind of a system would they want? How would law be made? So, just one example of a parliament, but it's the one I know best. We have two houses. Officially, we have two houses, the Commons and the Lords. Only one is directly elected. The second house, the House of Lords, though unelected, acts in a purely advisory capacity, and crucially, it cannot veto or begin law. All the proceedings of both are televised and transmitted immediately, and the government is drawn from this parliament, predominantly from the Commons. Its ministers are answerable regularly to this parliament, and it can be removed at set intervals along with every other member of the the House of Commons. Or, if we were starting this state afresh, would we want a system by the lawmaking groups of the European Union? First, the most important is the European Commission. Only the Commission can propose law. These progress to the Council. There are no popular elections of the officials, of the commissioners. There's one per member state. The Council of Ministers, or relevant member state ministers, passes legislation through a majority vote, officially, but we'll come back to that. The national veto is now almost gone. The Council is attended to by something called co-repair, or the Committee of Permanent Representatives, which tries to reach agreement on Commission proposals before they reach the Council. And recent research shows that 70 to 90% of decisions, of Council decisions, are actually made like this. And the system contains a parliament, but it cannot propose law. It's often not consulted, and it can frequently be ignored. I just want to talk about the two broad procedures. You might want to research this yourself. One is the ordinary legislative procedure, where if there is no agreement between the Council and Parliament, the Council can adopt legislation unanimously, or the special legislative procedure, where the European Parliament, so this includes international agreements like potential UK-EU agreement, the European Parliament can reject or accept. Sometimes it can amend, but the Council does not have to take this into account. Meanwhile, although the Parliament operates in a relatively transparent manner, the Council does not. All its meetings are closed, which gives it an informational advantage over the Parliament. So, for me, that's the fundamental difference between a parliamentary democratic system and the EU. In a parliamentary democratic system, only the elected chamber may propose law. But in the EU, only the unelected chamber, only the least democratic, can begin law. So it's important to understand these different blocks. Let's go through the Commission, Council, European Parliament, and co-repair to understand how they basically function. And this comes from research we've done, research that other political scientists have done. I'm going to be as merciful as possible and spare you a lot of the detail, but I do think it's important to get that picture. The Commission has great power over the other institutions. Obviously, it has the power to propose legislation, or, as it's been put, to decide what is decided. So this is a directional power from the least democratic institution. In my view, it has a fundamental lack, I should say, of liberal democracy. Unelected. Decision on who sits on it is taken behind closed doors. It recycles politicians who frequently have been democratically rejected. So, for example, Labour leader Neil Kinnock lost an election in the UK in 1992, and then not so long after that became our commissioner. So there's something fundamentally undemocratic about it being almost like a retirement home for rejected politicians whose ideas have not passed the test of democratic choice. Very, very well-embursed retirement home with great pensions. So although the EP has to approve the commissioners who are put before it, it cannot reject individuals. It has to approve, or otherwise, the entirety, the whole group. So this is an illusion of accountability. And no one is allowed in the commission room without the permission of the commissioners. So in the most important lawmaking body in the EU is entirely closed to the public. It's the very opposite of a televised House of Commons. There is the concept, you'll hear a lot about the concept of subsidiarity in the EU. The subsidiarity. There are responsibilities that nation states, the member states have. There are responsibilities that the Commission has. However, the ultimate decision on the extent of that subsidiarity rests with the Commission. There is a yellow card system where nation states can object. So the level of subsidiarity is ultimately decided by the Commission. Furthermore, there does seem to be the growing dominance of the Commission by one state. And I'll read you a quote from our former ambassador to Berlin, Sir Paul Lever, in his recent book, Berlin Rules. He says, Germany's view is sought by the Commission before it acts, and by other governments before they decide. So long as the position of the German government remains open, discussion and argument can thrive. Once that position is decided, it is typically the end of the matter. This obviously is an area of great controversy in the UK press, particularly the liberal-leaning so-called UK press. But we have to ask ourselves, if this is a forum for the cooperation of nations, can it withstand, ultimately, one nation becoming economically and politically considerably more powerful than the rest? Now, the Council of Ministers meetings are also closed. Qualified majority voting, or QMV, has now almost replaced the veto of nation states, which was intended to protect the national voice. However, this QMV is now being replaced by consensus, whereby there is no need for a vote. Consensus does not require unanimity, it just means no one expresses opposition rather than everyone agrees. So it's becoming impossible to know how agreement is reached. Again, we are concerned that there's institutionalized German dominance through the double majority system that QMV has required since 2017. And basically the rationale goes like this. To pass a law through QMV, what you now need is at least a vote representing at least 55% of member states, comprising at least 15 states, and representing 65% of the EU population. So this means that whenever Germany leads a caucus of Eurozone states, they get 66% of the population, they get over that threshold. So there is essentially now an inbuilt majority for Germany and the countries who received bailout packages through the fiscal capacity of Germany, basically debtor countries, which is a great concern in terms of the balance of power, or should be, within the EU. Is the European Parliament really a parliament? The central feature of a parliament is typically the power to propose law, which it doesn't have. 85% of the proposals that reach the European Parliament are now agreed by first reading, which suggests there's a relatively low level of analysis of law. When it does make amendments, 73% of these, this is 2014 figures, so they do need rechecking, but it's relatively recent. 73% of these are now rejected by the Council, which does not have to give reasons. One political scientist, and we'll go to sort of quite in-depth readings at the end if you want to read more, she has expressed it like this. The EU executive branch does not depend on a majority in the European Parliament. Unlike in liberal democracies, EU decision-making need not reflect the will of the majority, unquote. There are other problems with this. The constituencies are typically enormous. Again, so people don't know who their MP is. Again, MEPs are frequently recycled politicians, as we call it. They're people who have been democratically rejected as MPs. The leaders of parties choose who gets seats. And I'm afraid, again, the same trend is emerging with apparent German dominance of these institutions. German MEPs are most likely to be on the winning side, and we can go back to reasons for that at the end. Finally, the Committee of Permanent Representatives is the Committee of Nation-State Ambassadors to the EU. We've looked at how the Council of Ministers seems to dominate the European Parliament, but increasingly this unelected committee seems to dominate the Council. So we have bureaucrats essentially dominating elected ministers who at least have or had a serious role in the EU. It was meant to be the preparatory body for the Council of Ministers. Obviously, these are diplomats, they're bureaucrats, they are there formally in a democratic system to serve ministers. Its documents are unpublished, and its aim is now to seek agreement on Commission proposals before they get to the Council. Remember the dynamic here. If you're a minister, you fly into Brussels, you're busy. A British minister has a constituent he or she needs to worry about. They're as a minister back home, they have to attend Parliament. They don't spend that long in Brussels, and so they want things prepared for them by this committee. 70 to 90% of council decisions, latest research shows, are now adopted, having already been made by this committee. What it does is the council discusses A points, which is those are decisions that co-repair has already taken, and those are simply adopted without discussion, just ticked off. And B points, the discussions are decisions not yet agreed by co-repair, where there may be a vote or there may just be consensus. Most of the points it now receives are A points. They have been, most of what the council decides has been decided by bureaucrats in advance. So, my view on this will not have escaped you. I believe this situation, this system is becoming less liberal and the institutions are becoming less democratic, but there's even more at work. So let's dig briefly a little deeper. And I must say that by getting this understanding, you're already just so far beyond what most people even appreciate about the way the EU works, the way laws are made. We seem to be moving from codified decision-making to informal closed group-based decision-making, which I suggest is pre-modern in the way laws are passed. So what conclusions might we draw from this? Actually, just very briefly, what I'd say that the groups to look into there are called trilogues. This is what I mean by informal pre-modern decision-making. They comprise representatives from the Commission, from MEPs, and from civil servants. And what this does in devolving decision-making to trilogues is it gives the Commission power to analyze and decide on the laws that it proposes. So it brings power in a circular manner back to the Commission. So what are the conclusions we can draw from this? Increasingly, we're seeing informal practices replace codified practices. We're seeing relatively open decision-making superseded by fundamentally closed decision-making. And the question must now be asked, is Europe, the originator of democratic civilization, fundamentally under a democratic civilization as a result of this form of lawmaking? Look, I think the question is not, it's not easy to draw a reassuring answer from that. Given that we are here discussing the new serfdom, going back to Hayek, I think we need to take that question very seriously indeed. So let's return to those qualities of liberal government. Directly elected versus unelected, transparent versus opaque, ability or inability to remove lawmakers, revocable versus unrevocable law, comprehensible versus labyrinthine. We were talking about why is it that the British political class, especially the civil service, has reacted with such horror to Brexit, to this horrendous decision? And she said, well, because I mean, you know, I was briefly a contractor to the civil service through a private company, and I can tell you, people were locking themselves in rooms crying the day after the referendum vote came through. I mean, the shock was, you cannot believe the horror. And Victoria said to me, well, you know that moment in the Terminator films when the robots become aware and then Skynet takes over? That's like the EU to bureaucrats. Because what the EU gives them is the power to decide. Before they were told what to do by ministers who were elected under a democracy. They love the EU because they get to make law. So that the horror that power would be taken away from them was incomprehensible. I don't want to go any further with the comparisons to the Terminator movies. Let's not get hysterical here. All right. Why am I talking about sausages? Bismarck made this famous statement. He says, laws like sausages cease to inspire respect in proportion as we know how they are made. But what that is that saying, don't worry about the system, worry about the outcomes. And my thesis is wrong. You can't do that. First, you could make the liberal outcomes argument of all sorts of authoritarian systems. The Chinese economy has manifestly got more liberal since 1976. You cannot say this is a liberal system generating these relatively liberal outcomes. That's an extreme example, but you see my point. However, the same fundamental premise applies with the EU. In fact, this illiberal system, in my view, seems to be generating increasingly economic and socially illiberal outcomes. And I just want to run through, we've talked about this regulatory state, I just want to run through some examples. These are general data protection regulation. If you want to look into how the EU is affecting economies, look into these. Alternative investment funds regulations, MiFID II, which is the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, and the Dyson case. I'm not going to sort of go through all these issues in tremendous detail. But what these regulations do in digital and in the financial world is they increase the regulatory cost on SMEs, on small and medium-sized businesses, in a manner that big corporates can afford. So just to give you one example, MiFID II, which covers almost all trading, including bonds and securities, have costs that have been estimated by an economic consultancy in the UK at between £250,000 and £400,000 for the average company, which immediately puts out of business a whole swathe of SMEs at the advantage of big corporates who can afford it. The Dyson case is very interesting. You know James Dyson, he makes his company makes Hoovers and vacuum cleaners and hand dryers and so on and so forth. So the EU General Court in 2015 said that the way these things are tested, these machines should be tested without any dust in them. And this was lobbied for by the major corporates who are making the old form of vacuum cleaners with bags, because his vacuum cleaners famously don't have any bag, right? It's just a plastic cylinder, looks really cool. The Queen was recently pictured in Buckingham Palace, with a Dyson heater, so everyone's that brand has obviously gone establishment now, but it used to be quite edgy. So clearly these incumbents realized that he had outcompeted them, he'd out-innovated them. And so he had to spend 5 years and ultimately won, but wasted 5 years of legal costs, which most companies would not be able to afford. The man's a billionaire, he's got a very successful firm. Demonstrating that this was manifestly unfair and this regulation had been created to favor those companies that weren't innovating. And this goes on and on and on. Why does this matter? What are regulations? Regulations are how we shape our economy. And if we shape our economy such that the big incumbents have an advantage, you destroy what we have known since the 1950s is the primary driver of economic growth, the most important driver, which is innovation, because you destroy the incentive and the capacity of challengers to innovate. So when you hear big corporates being asked, what's good for the economy? Remember that that's kind of like asking a tiger what's good for the jungle. Tiger doesn't care about the jungle. Tiger wants to turn the jungle into dinner. And so we have these constant intellectual battles with the representatives of the big corporates in the UK, like the CBI, who are intensely pro-EU. They love this system because they can lobby. Why do I have a picture here of Song Dynasty China in about 1200? I don't want to talk about regulation all day. I'm going to take this argument from a book by another colleague of mine. I'm quite happy to reproduce other people's opinions. It's called Stephen Davis, and he's recently written a great book called The Wealth Explosion, which I really recommend. He says if you go back to 1200, what you'll see is a state that anybody would have expected would create the Industrial Revolution. China, Song Dynasty China. It had lots of inventions, it had relatively liberal system of inheritance, women could inherit businesses, it's quite unusual, quite well protected property rights, and then it totally collapses. And what happens is the Mongol conquest and the reaction to the Mongol conquest, which is the Ming Dynasty. And the Ming Dynasty scraps all this, turns against private property rights, stops exploration, and centralizes the state. And at this point, China has a problem. That it's essentially the problem is that it's very big indeed. And if you are an entrepreneur, you don't want to pursue a career as a government mandarin, you can't escape. there's a geographically determinist argument here to do with the size and shape of China. If you look at China and compare it to Europe, you'll notice that by comparison, Europe has lots of peninsulas, islands, mountain ranges. It seems to lend itself, as Clemens described yesterday, to the emergence of lots and lots of competing states. If that sounds like a just so story, we should consider that that almost didn't happen. Because at one point, through the Holy Roman Empire, one dynasty, the Habsburgs, somewhat like the Ming, were on the edge of creating a European superstate. But it didn't happen. What happened instead was the Dutch, in particular, launched their gunpowder revolution, nice Chinese innovation there, put to work. And these revolutions spread across Europe, and essentially nation states start to emerge that are competitors to a unified European superstate. What's that got to do with innovation in general? Elites don't like innovation. Elites have a problem with innovation because innovation creates competing elites. What you need to get an elite to like innovation is you need competition from other elites nearby, because they need to know that if they don't let their economy innovate and if they don't create new stuff, they will be swept away by the countries that do. And for that, you need competing systems of rules. So Clemens is right to talk about we don't want too much harmonization. If we harmonize too much, we will cease to have that. Problem is, it's happening. What I'm proposing ultimately in this argument is that the evidence is already there that this so-called age of dynamism is ending in Europe. Top 10 most innovative companies in the world? How many in Europe? 1. What's that company? Listed on New York, on the New York Stock Exchange. Not a great place to innovate anymore. And if you don't do that, you will, yeah, that's Spotify, by the way, somebody said. You will end the age of dynamism. We've come to understand that this period since 1700 is normal. It's not normal. It's incredibly abnormal in human history, and it does seem to be at risk of ending in Europe. Right, so there's the scare story. Indeed, the Holy Roman Empire, as discussed yesterday, does seem to be similar in many ways to this system. And I just want to go into a kind of a philosophical digression about what the problems with this are. The Oxford historian Peter H. Wilson, who wrote The Holy Roman Empire, 1,000 Years of Europe's History, is brilliant if you want to spend, years reading this tome. He's written the following. Historians openly present the empire as a blueprint to create a Europe of the regions. Many countries have launched prizes based on its symbols. Germany's culture minister presented it as the model of a functioning supra-state order, launching the Charlemagne Prize for European integration. Charlemagne, Emperor Charlemagne being the father of the Holy Roman Empire. The problem with this is that it depended on what Wilson has called a corporate authoritarian social structure, in which the concept of uniform equality conflicted with the Holy Roman Empire's corporate rights, which were designed to guard against exploitation by other groups, because this is not a unified state. And the empire itself became seen as the ultimate source of individual or communal liberties, with the authorities often granted by its culture with the superior ability to understand what Wilson calls the mysteries of state. Although writers like Kant, Immanuel Kant, who was a great influence on Jean Monnet, the father of functionalism and really the philosophical godfather of the European Union, have described it as a model for a European system, Wilson says it used pre-modern methods of consensus seeking in order to contrast with sovereign states and individual rights. And we do have to go back to competing schools of what liberalism is. I think among, if you like, intellectual Eurosceptics in the UK, it's worth knowing that there's a kind of growing belief that I think you have some competition between traditionally Holy Roman Empire and to some extent Germanic concepts of classical liberalism and Anglosphere and French classical liberalism. The contrast is between freedom entails belonging to an empire rather than freedom from it. The expression of freedom as specific liberties given by a state rather than liberty, which is inherent and can be overridden by a state. And a superstate that gives liberties is also liable to have to entrench local elites. We've looked at the potential problems with that. So yeah, this is the risk. Is the age of dynamism over? Sustained innovation is extremely unusual, and it depends on competition. In my view, in many people's view, between elites. What of the future? Once more, to abuse going second in this fascinating debate. Clemens, quite rightly, said that you would not want in the EU the harmonization of the fiscal harmonization of tax, and the harmonization of militaries in particular, and those would be red flags about what's going on. What's happening? Over Christmas, the Commission quietly released a consultation document suggesting that it would like to remove the final bastion of the national veto, which is tax, and replace it with qualified majority voting, and we've seen how that works. Protests are already coming in from Ireland and Hungary in particular. This is manifestly to the disadvantage of smaller, competing, less wealthy European economies who need tax flexibility to attract companies. If tax flexibility, if tax competition disappears, does harmonization generally favor a less or more regulated and less or more taxed system? I think it's not hard to work out that the drivers for harmonization are France and Germany, particularly France, that would like to eliminate this competition and move to a high tax regime. Next, PESCO, the permanent structured cooperation, is what Juncker recently described as a single European army. We're doing lots of research on what this means. I'll be glad to send you more information. This will be a combined European army that manifestly will not be under democratic control. So that is, to be precise, from a philosophical standpoint, that's the monopoly on violence that a state must maintain, removed from democratic control. And there are other areas of concern: the European Public Prosecutor and Europol, the European Police. The former will have the right to pursue prosecutions separate to nation-state authorities, and is being launched through enhanced cooperation, which is a method whereby some member states, even if they don't have a majority, through the normal channels, can start developing these offices and mechanisms. Again, the thesis is that harmonization itself must be ultimately illiberal, because it reduces choice and it prevents actions. And a system that reduces, not increases choice is not, according to my personal take on classical liberalism, fundamentally liberal. However, it's inherent to the project, because the denial of democratic choice, of the ability of member states to compete with each other on rules, regulations, taxes, militaries, and so on, is at the core of the philosophical project of its founder, Jean Monnet, which is called functionalism, which is moving those decisions to a bureaucracy. Really, finally, I would like to go full circle. I don't know if you're familiar with the now deceased Oxford political philosopher and great classical liberal Sir Isaiah Berlin, who was originally a Latvian Jew who had fled and made his home in the UK. His book, Freedom and Its Enemies, is a brilliant primer on a great deal of philosophy that I think informs this Eurosceptic classical liberal view. And I'll just read briefly from a recent piece about him to finish with. He said, or rather this is about his work, that the idea that integration could decrease weight of regulation dates to Immanuel Kant, who is often called a classical liberal philosopher, who took it upon himself to build a plan for nothing less than perpetual peace, and his followers like Friedrich Schelling described a pan-European, perhaps worldwide federation that would create it. Though Kant upheld freedom as a universal right, he was also prone to the authoritarian. Rights, again, were things specified by the state and not natural and inherent. Believing passionately also in rationality, Kant perceives that all rational men would desire the same kind of conduct. One man he inspired was Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was inspired by this collectivist direction for liberalism. In human affairs, we're talking about after the 30 Years' War or after Napoleon, these affairs continue to be a frightening and cacophonous chaos of intellectual conflict and could not apparently institute order. So the minds of people like Fichte began to seek a more simple order to establish irrefutable structures. And more than anyone, he did so by launching a concept of freedom profoundly different in the late 18th century. And so what they meant was the end of a freedom that guards against liberty, that sees individual liberty as potentially at risk from encroachment by others. He warned also that ordinary men should not expect to understand them. He said, "To men as they are in their ordinary education, our philosophical theory must be unintelligible. It is as if they were talking to men blind from birth." So only a vanguard could carry this torch of freedom. He also lived in a world in which if a prince were a tyrant and abused you, these were fundamentally natural misfortunes. These were a part of the world he lived in. So the things one could prevent were few, and the very idea of freedom became at once impossible and wonderful, a kind of distant utopia. What Isaiah Berlin suggests is that this philosophical turn was a turning inwards, where men with no hope of getting what they want begin trying to deprive themselves of the want itself. This is a way of finding freedom in an unfree state. A strategic retreat to inward serenity and a very profound moment in philosophy. So man, therefore, was in great part a slave through things over which he had no control. There is essentially a kind of political quietism that comes from this. Morality becomes one's own project, a question of projecting oneself, and so political activity becomes a type of self-projection. The leap in Fichte's thought is that only when this inner self is active can we be truly free. But this self, this spirit, is not isolated. And crucially, strange conclusions begin to emerge about a self that does not represent individual human feelings at all. But Kantian classical liberalism is then put to use for the service of a super self, that great rationalizing authority. What has become of freedom in all this, asks Isaiah Berlin. The individual freedom whereby, within limits, a man can be frivolous and go to the good or the bad. The over-self can now decide about all that. So freedom has become submission. As Isaiah Berlin states, as for freedom, individual freedom, where is that now? The freedom of each man to be allowed, within certain limits at least, to live as he likes. Individual freedom becomes a choice made by something personal. It becomes submission to the superself. These two notions of liberty, the liberal and the authoritarian, and the fact that the word freedom has become a genuine and central symbol in both, is at once remarkable and, he suggests, fundamentally sinister. Lots of further reading. I will leave you with those questions. I mentioned Isaiah Berlin, Freedom and Its Betrayal, sorry, is actually his name. Sir Paul Lever, the former ambassador, wrote Berlin Rules. Stephen Davis's excellent book, The Wealth Explosion. And there are lots, I'll send you slides at the end if you're interested. But there are lots of academic, political, scientific works. Oxford Handbook of European Union Law, research by Kardashever and Tolberg, and Piedrafita and Miller. The final publication is from the House of Commons Library, by the way. Thank you so much.